And now I am here with Hollis Schwartz, a U.S. Army World War II veteran, along with Joshua Seimer, who is currently serving in the Minnesota Army National Guard and is also a U.S. Army Operations Iraqi Freedom veteran. So thank you for joining me today and talking about some of your stories and experiences. So maybe you can start out by telling us about your service, and then maybe finish with what your connection is to Chaska. You want to start us out, Hollis?
Yes, I'm a native of Surrey County, and in the fall of 1944 I got my draft notice. In January 18th of 1945 I was inducted into the Army at Fort Snelling, Minnesota, and then went to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri to get my uniform, and to Camp Joseph T. Robinson in Arkansas for training as an infantry replacement. World War II was winding down at that time. Of course, we didn't know it, so they needed replacements to invade Japan. So when I completed my training in Little Rock, Arkansas, I went to Fort Riley, Kansas, then to Fort Ord, California, Camp Anza, California, and then aboard a troop ship in the port of Los Angeles. I left that port on the first day of August 1945 and arrived in the Philippine Islands on the 28th of August, and of course you know what happened in the month of August 1945. The surprise was that we did not know the war was over because we traveled alone in our troop ship, blacked out at night, zigzagged, and avoided radio communication. So it wasn't until we dropped anchor in Manila that we knew the war was over. And we say thank goodness, because the mission we were sent there to invade Japan became moot. And so I spent a couple months until October in the Philippines, and the sergeant called us together one morning and said, does anyone know how to type? And of course, no one volunteers because you may be digging latrines. But he said, no, this is real. We need typists. So I put my hand up. I had taken typing in high school. And 2 days later, I went to Clark Field, got on a C-47, spent one night on Okinawa, and then to Osaka, Japan, and to Kobe, Japan, where I served a year in the occupation working in military government. General MacArthur had set up a standard operational procedure at that time that all labor, buildings, services, everything had to be requisitioned through the prefecture offices. We did not rape and destroy that country, rather we did everything legally. And as a result, we gained an ally in the long run. I spent a year there. I met 3 other fellows that were like I. We did not smoke or drink. We behaved quite well and had a delightful time in occupation, if you can call that delightful. But we made the most of our opportunities. 1946, November, I was discharged from Yokohama. I got on a troop ship, went to Fort Lewis, Washington, and was discharged at that time. I then used the GI Bill of Rights to get a degree from the University of Minnesota, where I met my wife, who was in the Cadet Nurse Corps of World War II. She was an RN from the University of Minnesota. She did not have to serve because the war had ended. So we both have some World War II experiences in the background.
Very neat. I'm actually familiar with Fort Lewis, Washington. I spent some time there. That's where I went to my primary leadership development camp to become a sergeant in the National Guard with Wisconsin, but that's a very pretty base there,
Yes.
with the Mountaineer in the background.
One of my favorite areas of the United States, next to Minnesota.
Great. And what's their connection to Chaska, Hollis?
When I was taking agriculture at the University of Minnesota, my wife and I moved to Colorado upon my graduation because we both loved to ski, and almost starved to death and came back to Minnesota, and I worked in the cattle breeding business for 38 years, working for a company in New Prague, and was sent to Chaska to work with the farmers in insemination of cattle for 6 years. Eventually I became a field man and ultimately the production manager, and managed the laboratory for 30 years in New Prague until I retired. So I'm very familiar with Carver County, working with these great farmers, and now you can't find 10 cows in the area that I serviced at one time. Carver County was called the Golden Buckle of the Dairy Belt. It had more cows per square mile than any county in the state of Minnesota. So that was the ideal place to be to work with the cattle people.
Very neat. Joshua, can you tell us about your experience in service and your connection to Chaska as well?
Sure. I grew up not far from here. I grew up in the western suburbs. Left to go to college. Did our OTC. I commissioned and served in the active duty Army for about 7 years, from 1997 to 2004 at Fort Hood in Kuwait and in South Korea. Returned to Minnesota in 2004, started graduate school, joined the Minnesota National Guard. Have since done 2 deployments to the Middle East with the Minnesota National Guard, both with 1st Brigade, 34th Infantry Division, and moved to Chaska after I finished my master's degree in 2008 to be close to where I worked, and also because we liked a lot of things about the community. Turned out to be a good decision. We've stayed here ever since.
Great. And can you tell us a little bit more about what you do with the National Guard currently?
Sure. I commissioned as an infantry officer. I did my basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, and served as a platoon leader. So I started off in charge of about 30 soldiers. On active duty, I made my way up to company commander, where I was in command of about 120. And then I've done a few different jobs in the Minnesota National Guard, staff, operations and planning work at higher level commands. I've also been a battalion commander for 1st Battalion, 194th Armor Regiment. So a tank battalion, where we had a mixture of tanks and infantry in the battalion. And currently I'm assigned as the garrison commander at Camp Ripley.
Wow, that's an impressive resume there, Joshua.
Thank you.
It looks like you brought a challenge coin with you today. You want to share a little bit about that?
Sure. And when I tell more of the story we're going to talk about a little later, you'll understand a bit more of the symbolism. But this was the challenge coin that I had in my battalion, 1st Battalion, 194th Armor Regiment, based on the design of that the previous commander had. And on the front, it has the first half of our battalion motto, which is Remember Baton. And it shows on the front side modern equipment, an M1 Abrams tank and an M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. And on the reverse, it has the second half of the battalion motto, Never Forget. So remember baton, never forget. And on the back, World War II era M3 Stuart tank and M3 half-track infantry fighting vehicle. So the corresponding equipment from World War II. As well as we also have the emblem of 1st Brigade, 34th Infantry Division, and our regimental crest.
Pretty awesome. A lot of symbolism there in that one coin.
Yep.
And Hollis, you brought with you a really neat picture today. Could you tell us a little bit more about the background story of that picture?
The photograph shows 5-star General Dwight Eisenhower visiting our installation in Kobe, Japan, where we worked with military government. He was there on inspection with his staff, wanted to know if we were aware of what we were doing. He said, "Do you know what you're doing here? What's your purpose here?" And fortunately, we did, because we had been served by our officers quite well, and we knew that we were procuring the necessary things to function in that area in the legal way laid down by our standard operational procedures. Dwight Eisenhower walked up to this soldier, a friend of mine. I was standing 4 or 5 feet away, and he said, reached out with his hand, and he said, "My name is Dwight Eisenhower, what's yours?" The soldier was flabbergasted, as most of us were. And he showed his humility, his real leadership came through at that time.
Very cool, yeah. It's a really neat picture.
Yes.
You don't get to see him that close very often in a picture.
My wife and I did see him later when he returned to Denver, Colorado to run for president.
Joshua, back to you here. So how does your current service with the Guard educate their members about Memorial Day and other military history?
Sure. Well, there are many ways we do it, but one way that I want to talk about is by the focus on unit or organizational histories. So I talked about how I commanded the 1st Battalion, 194th Armor Regiment. A battalion is about, that type of battalion is about 900 soldiers. Just to give you an idea of the size of that organization. And that battalion was originally formed right before World War II from various National Guard units. And before the war started, deployed to the Philippines, which at the time were a U.S. possession, but were preparing for independence, and ended up being invaded by Japan as soon as war broke out. And because of the destruction of the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, there was no way to get reinforcements to the Philippines. The American and Filipino soldiers there, including my former battalion, were cut off and forced to fight without supplies of reinforcement. They held out for 5 months, but were eventually forced to surrender. And upon their surrender, the Japanese marched them over 100 miles with no food or water, executing many of them along the way in what became known as the Bataan Death March. As many as 10,000 U.S. and Filipino soldiers were killed in that event. And then during the ensuing 3.5 years that they were in prisoner of war camps, about half of the remainder died from maltreatment, malnourishment, disease, execution, etc. before they were liberated. But they were many of the same places that you were. Landed in Manila, defended Clark Field, and then defended Bataan in the Philippines, and then many of them ended up in POW camps in Japan when the liberation came. So we make that connection. We talk about it being our history. So when the 1st Battalion, 194th, talks about the historical World War II 194th Tank Battalion, they don't use the words, they did this, they use the words, we did that, to emphasize the fact that every soldier today has to carry on that memory. That's becoming even more important now. We have only one veteran left from that, the original 194th Tank Battalion in the World War II era. Had about 450 who served and about 200 who survived the war. So it's incumbent on every soldier to carry that memory. But we also remember their individual stories. A couple of them, just to give an example, we talk about people like Robert H. Brooks. He was the first member of our battalion killed in World War II and the first member of the United States Army Tank Force killed in fighting in World War II. He was killed during the bombing of Clark Field on December 8, 1941. Now, he had originally been part of a Kentucky National Guard unit that ended up being attached to this Minnesota National Guard battalion. Now, what's interesting is he was African American. Integrated units did not exist in the U.S. Army then. The 194th was not an integrated unit. He had very light skin, so he passed as white. And it's just ironic to think that the first person in our battalion to give that ultimate sacrifice was someone who had to lie about who he was to have the opportunity to serve in that battalion, to serve a country where his parents, who had darker skin than than him and were noticeably African American couldn't get a hotel room, couldn't buy a hamburger at their local restaurant, and faced that kind of discrimination. So if you want to talk about strength of character, resilience, determination, talk about people like Robert H. Brooks. We also talk about people like Wilmer Frank, who grew up not far from here, graduated from high school, joined the Minnesota National Guard, mobilized with his battalion, ended up at Camp Lewis, Washington, and then in Manila and Bataan. Survived the death march, but only barely, and was severely ill and died in a POW camp a few weeks later. And so he was a local soldier whom we lost, and 75 years later, his sister died, one of his sisters. He was the oldest of 13. And in her obituary, it mentioned prominently her continuing grief and sense of loss over her brother had been lost after the Bataan Death March. So 75 years, that gap in that family was still strong enough and noticeable enough that was a major part of his sister's obituary. But we also make sure to link that to why did it matter? Why was it worth it for those soldiers to make the sacrifice that they did? And there's two pictures that I often show, two pictures that are on the background of my computer and sit on my desk. And one is a woman and 3 children walking along a railroad siding at Auschwitz concentration camp. They didn't realize it when the photo was taken, but they were being taken to their deaths. And the other photo is from the liberation of Manila, when U.S. forces landed in the Philippines in late 1944, 1945, and took back Manila and the rest of the Philippines from the Japanese. In Manila particularly, the Japanese committed immense atrocities against the civilian population there. And so I also have a photo of a U.S. soldier in the liberation of Manila carrying a Filipino girl to safety from the battle and away from the Japanese atrocities that were going on. So those two things are a reminder of what we fought against, the atrocities that were committed, but also what we fought for in the image of that Filipino girl.
Thanks for sharing that, Joshua. Those are very eye-opening stories and very inspiring to hear just, the sacrifices that people made and the courage that they had to do that. So, thank you.
It's important to talk about it on a general level, I think, but by making sure you have a connection to specific individuals like Brooks, Frank, like that Filipino girl, like that family at Auschwitz, you make it more real. And by having that organizational connection to say, if I'm a soldier in this battalion today, whether it's the 194th Battalion carrying on the tradition of Bataan, other examples include the 34th Infantry Division with their history of fighting to liberate Italy, 136th Infantry Regiment fought to liberate the Philippines, all Minnesota National Guard units. It makes that connection personal, and it gives you a stronger sense of why what you're doing today is important.
Yeah, that matters. Yeah, great. So Hollis, being a World War II veteran, what ways have you seen the meaning of Memorial Day change over the past 75 years?
We always celebrated Memorial Day, but it was a parade, a band, a few speakers, but now it has become much more personal because of your comments. I look back now, and when I landed in the Philippines, going past Corregidor, Bataan, and those places you mentioned, and realized how many suffered and died to get me into the Philippines along the way up there. Also, another part was there was still segregation even in 1945 when I took Army Basic in Little Rock, Arkansas. and we were still segregated in the occupation of Japan. The minority, if I can use that word, it's a foolish word, it was still in effect, that these people were separated, which was no more right than anything, as it should never have happened. I had the opportunity to see many cemeteries in the foreign countries. When I biked in Holland in the Elder Hostel, a number of years later, I saw the graves of the bomber pilots that flew over Europe. And the Dutch people took care of those graves, and they had the letters all polished on the names of those people. So you can see it's worldwide. And as far as change, I think maybe we need to get more personal about this, just as you did a few months ago.
So maybe to wrap up here, with this upcoming Memorial Day, or actually as people are watching this today, how are you spending your day today?
Today, I'll be reminiscing, probably looking at some of the mementos that I have from Army Basic. And I do have a number of photographs, being a friend of the photographer, official photographer in Japan, so I'm lucky to have those pictures. But I'll be thinking of those who are not here, who gave their lives.
Okay. How about you, Joshua?
Very similarly, we'll be telling these stories. I'll be telling my children the stories that I know of, the story of Robert Brooks and Wilmer Frank, others that I knew personally, such as the 20 soldiers we lost during our 1st grade 34th Division's deployment to Iraq in 2005 to 2007. Friends like Chris Seifert, Eric Alton, tell the story of their aunt, who I was standing next to my parents in 1996 when the casualty assistance officer came to tell them news that I already knew about and they didn't, that she wasn't coming home. Because just like with Frank's sister, those holes, those gaps will always be there as long as we live. But as long as we preserve the memory of people like that, they're never truly gone from us. And so we'll have a cookout, we'll do all those, we'll have a day off of work and school, we'll do all those things. But we'll make sure we take the time to tell the stories of Bataan, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and so many others, and of the people that this holiday is for.
Great. Well, Hollis and Joshua, thank you so much for taking the time to share your stories, and thank you to both of you for your service to our country. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.